Hey guys, tonight we step not onto a battlefield, not into the clamour of kings, but onto a sun-warmed island in the eastern Aegean. Imagine the salt air drifting past your nose, the lazy slap of waves on a pebble shore, and gulls that sound like squeaky doors in need of oil. You're standing in Lesbos, a place that has seen countless travellers, traders and conquerors, but for tonight you'll know it as the cradle of one voice, a poet whose lines could whisper about longing more powerfully than generals shouting about conquest. You probably won't survive the wine they drank here without developing a headache the size of a marble temple, but at least you can survive my narration. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're awake enough, tell me your location and what time it is for you down in the comments. It's always fascinating to see this little community stretch from midnight beds to morning coffee mugs. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first whispers about Sappho's life begin with Lesbos itself. You trudge along winding lanes, hearing the chatter of market women and the slap of sandals on stone. Somewhere behind you, an olive press groans. It's the late 7th century BCE, give or take. Herodotus will be born much later, so don't expect tidy biographies. What we have instead are shred stories and a name that keeps glinting in the sun like a coin half buried in the sand. Sappho is said to have come from a noble family. The details slip through our fingers. Some names float around like Scamandronymus for her father, though historians still argue whether that's fact or fiction. Some accounts claim he drowned while she was young, others that he lived long enough to guide her into adulthood. As for her mother, the name Lyres lingers echoed in the tender verses where Sappho may speak to or about a daughter of the same name. Picture the childhood house, whitewashed 2 stories, a courtyard where figs dried on reed mats, chickens scratch near a clay oven, a servant stirs a pot of barley stew. At night, oil lamps flicker and shadows stretch against walls, while in a corner lies a lyre waiting. That instrument will be her closest companion, and you can almost imagine small hands reaching out to pluck its strings. Island life isn't idyllic. Lesbos is fertile, yes, but politics brew like storm clouds. Aristocratic families jostle for control, alliances form and snap, and neighbouring Mytilene feels more like a restless port city than a quiet refuge. If you were a girl of standing, your education wouldn't stop at weaving baskets. You'd be schooled in music, poetry, and perhaps in how to run a household with an iron hand, while keeping a smile painted across your face. Here's a quirky tidbit. Later, comic playwrights joked about Sappho's family being involved in purple dye trade. Imagine vats of stinking shellfish juice fermenting until it produces that dazzling royal purple. Not the kind of smell you'd want in your backyard, but it could fund some very fancy sandals. Whether true or not, it reminds you that even legends had to pay their bills somehow. The young Sappho would have heard sailors boasting about Phoenicia, Egypt, and Lydia. Lesbos sat on trade routes, soaking up foreign music, perfumes, and gossip. You can almost feel her imagination swelling with every tale. Perhaps one day she looked out at the horizon and thought, "There are as many songs as there are stars, and I want to catch a few." But her youth wasn't entirely smooth. Later, tradition claims she and her family were exiled to Sicily at some point, a political punishment. Historians still argue whether this exile happened in her childhood or adulthood, or at all. Yet the rumour lingers like a crease in parchment. Sappho knew what it was to be displaced, to long for her homeland, a theme that saturates her surviving lines. In Lesbos, women weren't voiceless shadows. They appeared in religious rituals, festivals, and even managed estates when men went sailing. For Sappho, this visibility meant space to breathe creatively. You can imagine her at a festival of Hera, where incense rises, garlands droop with dew, and girls in saffron robes sing. Maybe she watches and listens, eyes already measuring rhythm, storing it for her own verses. Her early education likely involved memorization. Epic poetry. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey dominated Greek ears. She would have learned to chant those lines, their formulaic patterns etching themselves like grooves in her memory. But while Homer sang of heroes hurling spears, Sappho's heart tilted toward the intimate, a smile, a glance the way desire can feel, like being struck with a whip of flame. One mainstream fact you can hang on to, she was later grouped by Alexandrian scholars among the 9 lyric poets of Greece, the only woman in that exclusive club. Already in antiquity, her genius was impossible to deny. In those first years on Lesbos, you can almost see her balancing roles: daughter, maybe sister, to 3 brothers, Charaxos, Lyrikos, and another whose name slips away. Ancient gossip even tells us Charaxos ran off to Egypt, fell in love with a courtesan, and had to be ransomed back. Sappho supposedly wrote verses scolding him. Family drama, 3rd century BCE style. Picture: twilight waves lap against dark rocks, the cicadas buzz, and a girl sits with a lyre. The first notes wobble, but then steady. She hums to herself, Aeolic syllables rolling off her tongue, and for a moment the whole island seems hushed. No one knows that centuries later, scholars, poets, lovers, and dreamers will chase those very words across time. You lean back now, hearing that faint, plucked note echo over the water. Lesbos isn't just an island, it's a beginning. And beginnings, as you'll see, have a way of outlasting the messy details of who fathered whom or which politician was in power. What remains is the image of a girl, her voice rising, carrying over the Aegean like the scent of figs on the wind. You're still on the island, but the scene has shifted. Picture a courtyard at dawn where the first rays of light catch on glazed jugs and the thin threads of smoke that curl from a cooking fire. Somewhere in the distance, a cock crows like it has an audience to impress. And there, sitting cross-legged with a wooden frame across her lap, Sappho practices on the lyre. The strings don't care about her aristocratic birth. If her fingers fumble, the sound will be all squeaks and twangs like a cat running across a harp. The musical apprenticeship of Sappho is easy to imagine, even if hard to prove. Ancient education prized poetry as much as arithmetic. But on Lesbos, the local flavor gave it something special. The Aeolic dialect of Greek, spoken here, had its own rhythms, softer and rounder than Attic Greek, and those syllables would become the soil in which her verse grew. Historians still argue whether she was formally trained in a school or simply absorbed knowledge through family circles and religious ceremonies, but either way she ended up wielding language like a craftsman handles fine bronze. Close your eyes and hear the hum of a chorus, young girls, maybe her companions, singing a hymn to Hera or Aphrodite. Their voices rise together, and behind them a flute pipes in shrill counterpoint. It's messy, it's loud, but it's ritual practice for the great festivals where entire communities gathered. In such settings, Sappho learned not only to compose words, but to shape them for performance. A poem wasn't a silent text, it was a song to be lived out in company. A quirky tidbit for you, the lyre itself was often strung with gut made from sheep or goats. Imagine her adjusting a string and realizing it had once bleated in a meadow, poetry quite literally born from livestock. Somewhere in that detail lies the strange humor of history. The most delicate love songs of antiquity may have been powered by a goat's intestines. As she grew, so did her mastery. She began to play with rhythm Aeolic meters that were less rigid than the Homeric hexameter. Instead of marching drums, her lines swayed like reeds in the breeze. And from this experimentation emerged the so-called Sapphic stanza, 3 long lines with a short kicker at the end. It was like inventing a brand new recipe, instantly recognizable, endlessly adaptable, and later imitated by poets from Catullus to Horace. Not a bad legacy for someone practicing in a sun-washed courtyard. You trudge along behind her through these early lessons, noticing how the everyday world keeps feeding her imagination. The crash of waves against rock, a metaphor for the surge of desire. The flight of swallows overhead, perfect imagery for fleeting joy. The squeaky door hinge that never gets fixed, probably less inspiring. But hey, even poets need material for their grumpier days. One mainstream fact worth remembering is that ancient Greek culture prized memorization to a degree that seems impossible now. Children learn dozens, even hundreds of lines by heart, reciting them aloud until the rhythm stuck in their bones. Sappho grew up in this oral tradition, and her poems were designed to be heard, repeated, and carried away in the mind like songs stuck in your head. But was she only a student? Some fragments suggest she herself trained others, forming a kind of circle where younger women learned music verse and ritual under her guidance. That's where the lines between apprentice and teacher blur. Historians still debate whether this was a formal school or more of a communal household tradition. Either way, you can imagine the scene: Sappho at the center, gently correcting a student's meter, her voice patient yet firm. And here's where you get a glimpse of the intimacy embedded in her work. Unlike Homer's tales of war, her lyrics focused on individual emotion, what it feels like when your heart stutters at the sight of someone, when desire burns hotter than a midsummer bonfire. That turn inward toward the personal is what made her stand out in a culture obsessed with epic heroes and public glory. Another quirky note: some ancient authors hinted that Sappho invented or at least popularized the plectrum, the little tool for strumming the lyre. Picture her tinkering with new techniques, restless, unwilling to settle for the same old strum everyone else used. Whether or not that's true, it speaks to her reputation as not just a singer, but an innovator. Now think of the weight of expectation. A young, aristocratic woman, already talented, surrounded by peers and elders who listened carefully. Every note was a test, every verse either shimmered or fell flat. You can feel the pressure, can't you? Yet it seems she thrived under it, bending form and sound until they carried her own distinct mark. By the time she reached adulthood, Sappho's musical apprenticeship had blossomed into artistry. The island air still smelled of olives and goat cheese, but now it also pulsed with songs that would travel across centuries. You might say that when she tuned her lyre, she was also tuning Western lyric poetry for the first time. Not bad for someone whose neighbors probably just thought she was another girl rehearsing for the festival. You step back from the courtyard, hearing the final note fade into the cicadas. The strings stop vibrating, but the sound seems to linger, woven into the hot air itself. That's the gift of training the body remembers long after the instrument rests. Sappho was ready now, not just to play, but to create, to weave words into a tapestry strong enough to carry her name through millennia. You're still wandering Lesbos, though now the air feels thicker, scented with garlands of flowers and the faint trace of incense. A group of young women gathers in a shaded courtyard, their laughter rising like birds startled from a fig tree. At the center, not aloof, but gently guiding, sits Sappho. This is the circle that later sources called her Thiassos, a community of women, both social and sacred, where music, poetry, and ritual flowed together as naturally as wine into a clay cup. Picture them preparing for a festival. The women weave crowns of myrtle and roses, their fingers sticky with sap, their dresses bright with saffron and indigo. One tries to balance a garland on her head and nearly sneezes it off. Another hums a tune she can't quite remember, earning an eye roll from the group. And Sappho, with that calm intensity, steps in to adjust the meter of a song or to suggest an image of dawn as rosy-fingered, not Homer's dawn, but hers, more intimate, less grandiose. Historians still argue whether this group was a formal cult, a school for aristocratic girls, or simply a cultural circle with no strict boundaries. The word Thiassos usually means a religious gathering, especially for worship of deities like Aphrodite or the Muses. Either way, these meetings offered a stage for Sappho to shape voices, refine performance, and transform emotion into art. Here's a mainstream fact: Greek women in aristocratic households often played central roles in ritual life. They sang choruses, led dances, and crafted offerings. Sappho's circle fit naturally into this framework, but she took the tradition and bent it toward lyric intimacy. Instead of hymns that vanished after the festival, her verses captured the sensations of love, jealousy, and longing, echoing them in language meant to endure. Imagine the scene at dusk, torches flare, casting shadows on stone walls, while the group sings a hymn to Aphrodite. The goddess, after all, wasn't just the deity of romantic love, but also of beauty, fertility, and binding social ties. To invoke her was to knit the group together. Some lines of Sappho's surviving poems call on Aphrodite directly, begging for relief from the torments of desire. You hear the plea rise from the group, their voices trembling with both ritual awe and personal resonance. Now for a quirky tidbit later, satirical writers joked that Sappho ran what was basically a finishing school for wealthy girls. They painted it as half conservatory, half sleepover camp, with perfume poetry and plenty of gossip. While the tone is mocking, it gives you a glimpse of how even antiquity recognized the unusual power of a woman leading such a circle. If the men in town were debating politics in the agora, these women were debating which metaphor captured the pangs of longing more precisely. You can almost hear the conversations. Should it be, "My heart trembles like leaves in the wind," or "My chest burns like a coal in the brazier"? Sappho would smile, tilt her head, and say, "Why not both? But let the coal come last, the image will sting." One fragment that survives speaks of parting women leaving her circle, returning to husbands or new households. The tone is tender, bittersweet. She describes braiding their hair with violets, watching them walk away and feeling the ache of absence. You get the sense of a community always in motion, bound by song but scattered by circumstance. Historians still debate whether the intimacy expressed in these poems was literal or poetic convention. Were these women lovers, or was the lyric a performance of idealized affection? The truth lies in shadow, and maybe that's why her verses remain so charged. They refuse to be pinned down, insisting on lingering between friendship, ritual, and passion. By now you've probably noticed the contrast with Homer. His heroes clash in bronze armor under a wide sky. Sappho's heroines clasp hands in lamplight, whispering vows. She chose the private sphere, the felt world of emotions, and elevated it until it rivaled epic in impact. That in itself was revolutionary. Imagine one last vignette, the group seated beneath a pergola draped in grapevine, cicadas buzzing overhead. Sappho strums the lyre while her companions echo the refrain. Their voices overlap a little off-key, but the laughter that follows smooths out the imperfections. It's less about perfection than about presence, the shared moment, the shared song. By the time the torches burn low, the circle has become more than a gathering. It's a crucible, a place where raw feeling is smelted into verse, where memory itself seems to be forged. The Thiassos gave Sappho her stage, her audience, and perhaps even her reason to write. Without it, her voice might never have found its shape. As you walk away from the courtyard, the chorus lingers in your ear, part hymn, part confession, entirely human. The circle of women dissolves into the night, but their songs and hers keep echoing under the stars. The night on Lesbos drifts into morning, and with it comes the steady pulse of Sappho's growing voice. You wander through the narrow streets of Mytilene, past houses whose shutters creak open with the first heat of the sun. Somewhere, a donkey brays, determined to be louder than the marketplace gossip. And somewhere else, in a quieter courtyard, Sappho is coaxing words and rhythm into something no one has quite heard before. Her poetic voice is sharpening her lyric, becoming distinct. Up to this point, you've seen her as apprentice, as teacher, as part of a circle. Now the poems begin to take on her signature sound, compact, crystalline, yet carrying an emotional weight heavier than an amphora full of wine. The invention and use of the Sapphic stanza is the milestone here. 3 long lines, steady as footsteps, then a short fourth that drops like a pebble into still water. Even if you've never studied prosody, you can feel the effect, rhythm that promises continuity, then a sudden, quick intake of breath. Historians still argue whether she actually invented this form or merely perfected a tradition already in use. Either way, her name clings to it, a sign of just how deeply her craftsmanship impressed later scholars. And when you hear it aloud, you understand why. It's like music structured to echo, the heartbeat to rise and fall with the body's natural cadence. Imagine the setting, a symposium, not the rowdy, wine-soaked kind that Aristophanes loved to joke about, but a smaller, more refined gathering. Cushions are strewn across the floor, Cups of diluted wine are passed around, and the lyre rests ready. Someone asks Sappho to perform. She clears her throat, plucks a string, and begins. The rhythm steadies the room, and suddenly the noise of gossip and clinking pottery quiets. A mainstream fact: much of Sappho's poetry was written to be sung accompanied by lyre or barbitos. This wasn't silent reading, but performance art experienced in community. To hear her lines was to feel them vibrate through the room, sound-shaping silence. And then there's her imagery. She loved similes drawn from the natural world: flowers, stars, flame, even the sweetness of honey or the sharpness of apple. Simple images, yet charged with intimacy. Instead of Hector's spear or Odysseus's cunning, you're handed a violet crown, a glance that melts your knees, or the pain of desire, likened to fire under the skin. It's personal, human, and it pulls you in closer than epic ever could. Here's a quirky tidbit. An ancient commentator once complained that Sappho's language was too clear. Imagine that being accused of clarity. While Homer was praised for grandeur, she was gently scolded for simplicity. Yet that very simplicity is what makes her verses sparkle. Even now easy to read aloud in translation, even easier to imagine whispered across a courtyard 2.5 millennia ago. Another glimpse. Sappho didn't just write about desire, she wrote about its absence. In one fragment she lists what she loves most: not armies, not ships, not cavalry, but the person one loves. Historians still debate whether this was a deliberate contrast with Homer's martial values, or simply her turning the spotlight onto her own world. Either way, the shift is seismic. You step closer watching her at work. She drafts a line, then hums it, then discards it with a flick of her hand. Words are tested on the tongue, not the page. That's another thing to remember: writing in her day was fragile, often temporary. Papyrus could crumble, wax tablets could be wiped clean. What survived most often was memory lines carried in the minds of performers, recited until they stuck. One evening she sits with her circle and a girl asks, "What's the best thing in the world?" A question simple enough to be tossed off with a joke: goat cheese maybe, or shade in the heat. But Sappho answers with a poem telling them that it's not armies, not ships, not gold, but love. That answer lingers like a pebble dropped into water, rippling outward for centuries. The poetic voice you hear here is already layered with paradox. It's simple but complex, intimate but public, deeply personal, yet instantly recognizable. The invention of her stanza, the aeolic meters, she polished the images she summoned. All of it created a style so distinctive that later scholars didn't just preserve it, they canonized it. Picture the final moment of this scene: the courtyard, empty, the torches guttering low. On the table lies a half-finished garland, petals drooping. And in the silence, you can still hear her last verse, clipped and sudden, like the short fourth line of her stanza, ending, but never quite ended. The cicadas are buzzing again, and the heat of midday has you trudging down a sun-baked road that smells of time and dust. Somewhere ahead, you hear laughter light, lilting, interrupted now and then by the strum of a lyre. You follow the sound into a shaded courtyard, and there she is. Sappho, seated among friends, weaving words, not about gods smiting mortals or ships launching for Troy, but about something far more unsettling: the flutter in your chest when someone you adore walks into the room. Love and desire were her themes, but not in the abstract way epic poets handled them. She gave them flesh, pulse, and voice. In one fragment, she describes desire as a trembling that loosens the limbs. In another, she compares its sting to being struck by fire. You don't need footnotes to understand it. You just need to remember the last time your stomach flipped like a fish when your crush accidentally brushed your hand. Historians still argue whether her love lyrics were personal confessions or crafted performances. Was she laying bare her own heart, or was she adopting the role of a poetic voice to entertain and move her audience? The fragments tease us but never confirm, which may be why they still grip readers today. Imagine the group listening, young women leaning forward, half smiling, half embarrassed, hearing their own secret longings echoed aloud. Sappho strums the lyre, her voice soft but insistent. The verses float into the air, and for a moment the world outside politics, wars, taxes doesn't exist. Only the burn of desire and the cool balm of song remain. Here's a mainstream fact: Sappho frequently invoked Aphrodite, the goddess of love, in her verses. One of her most famous surviving poems is a hymn where she begs the goddess to come to her aid in love, to ease the ache of rejection, to tilt the scales of passion in her favor. That prayer is both ritual and confession, half sacred, half startlingly personal. And a quirky tidbit later, biographers, uncomfortable with her focus on love between women, invented whole stories of male lovers, even tossing in the legendary ferryman Phaon as an object of her affection. Some versions claimed she leapt off a cliff because of him. Most scholars see this as a later invention, a way of reshaping her legacy into something safer for male readers. You can almost hear Sappho snorting across the centuries at the thought. But her poetry doesn't need that embellishment. Listen to one fragment where she describes seeing someone your laughter. Oh, it shakes my heart in my chest. The words are direct, no mythological armor to hide behind. She strips love down to the stammering, breathless, knee-weakening truth. If Homer gave us gods disguised as swans, Sappho gave us the trembling knees. You walk further into the courtyard. A girl plays with a wreath of violets, another hums a line of the song. Their expressions are shy, but their eyes sparkle. You sense that these lyrics did more than describe emotion. They built community, binding listeners together in shared recognition. Desire wasn't shameful here. It was named, sung, and transformed into beauty. Historians still debate whether the so-called Sapphic eros was unique or part of a broader Aeolic tradition. But what's undeniable is the emotional intensity she gave to it. Her verses often feel like whispers, overheard, almost too private, yet somehow offered generously to anyone who would listen. Think of the courage in that. While warriors boasted of spears, she dared to boast of trembling hearts. While kings inscribed laws on stone, she etched longing into air with her voice. No wonder Plato later called her the 10th muse. Even the philosopher of reason couldn't resist the tug of her lyric. Now picture a sunset. The sky is smeared with saffron and indigo, the very colors of their garments. Sappho's circle gathers one last time, singing softly as shadows lengthen. A lyre note wavers, fades, and the words hang there fragile as moths fluttering around a torch. You exhale, realizing that 2.5 millennia later, you're still caught in those same trembling nets of desire. The courtyard fades behind you, and now you find yourself drifting into a larger, noisier space. The air is thick with wine and chatter, the scrape of sandals on polished stone, and the faint, tinny rattle of Aulo's pipes. A symposium is in progress, the kind where couches are strewn with cushions, amphorae are sweating with diluted wine, and the smell of roasted goat clings to the rafters. Into this setting steps Sappho, her lyre cradled like a trusted confidant. Her poetry wasn't confined to the intimate circle of women. It spilled outward into public performances, weddings, festivals, rites, and feasts. You can almost see her adjusting the strings while a crowd hushes expectant. Then her voice rises, not booming like a herald's, but clear and steady, carrying across the hall. Her verses were short enough to remember, melodic enough to repeat, and powerful enough to hold even a wine-blurred audience captive. Historians still argue whether she herself performed at symposia, or whether her works circulated through others who sang them. But the fact remains, her poems functioned in both private and public spheres, bridging intimate emotion and communal ritual. A mainstream fact: one category of her work included epithalamia wedding songs. These were sung during ceremonies, often in playful, teasing tones, blending blessing with wit. In one surviving fragment, she wishes joy to a bride and groom with imagery of dawn and roses. It's hard not to picture her leading the chorus, her verses framing the union with warmth and laughter. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some later writers claimed her songs were so popular at weddings that generations after her death, people still sang Sappho's hymns as part of the tradition. Imagine couples, centuries later, still walking into married life under her words, the equivalent of your cousin, insisting on playing the same first dance song at every reception. The public life of her poems also meant ritual. Festivals for gods and goddesses demanded song, and Sappho's verses often invoked Aphrodite or Hera. You can picture a procession winding down a hill, girls in saffron tunics, garlands of ivy, in their hair the smell of roasting meat mixing with incense. The chorus sings, led by Sappho, their feet stamping out rhythm on the packed earth. The lyrics don't just entertain, they sanctify. Historians still debate the balance between her personal poems and these communal works. Was she mainly a private lyricist whose verses happened to be sung at weddings, or was she also a civic performer composing pieces that stitched her community together? The fragments don't give us certainty, but they give us glimpses, teasing bridal songs, solemn hymns, playful choruses. You trudge alongside her, weaving through the crowd, watching her words ripple outward. A man at the back laughs, repeating a line. A woman at the front wipes her eyes, caught off guard by the intimacy of a verse. This is the magic of her public performance, personal truth, made communal so that everyone feels they've glimpsed their own reflection in her song. Think of it this way: Homer gave Greece its shared memory of the past, but Sappho gave it a shared recognition of the present. While epic pulled the audience into a heroic, mythic, then lyric pulled them into the urgent now, the trembling before marriage, the sting of rejection, the sweetness of affection. That shift made her not just a singer, but a cultural force. A quirky image for you, some scholars suggest her poems might have been accompanied not only by lyre, but by dance. Imagine her circles swaying lightly, arms-linked sandals scuffing the courtyard as her lines looped through the air. It's not Broadway choreography, more like a ripple of motion, the body lending shape to the words. By the time the feast ends and the lamps sputter, her verses have done their work. Guests stumble home, still humming, still laughing, still carrying a line or two in their heads. And you, walking out into the night, realize that public performance gave her poetry wings, letting it escape the courtyard and travel across the island, across the sea, across time itself. The lyre grows quiet, the last note fading into the darkness. But in the silence, you can still hear the murmur of a wedding blessing, the laughter of bridesmaids, the solemn cry to Aphrodite, and the hush of a symposium leaning in to catch a final line. The night air shifts again, carrying you from the echo of symposium halls back into the quieter alleys of Mytilene. Lamps flicker behind shuttered windows, and somewhere a dog barks at nothing in particular. It's here in the hush of domestic space that the question of Sappho's private life rises like a whisper. Did she marry? Did she have a family? Did her verse echo from her own household as much as from public performance? The record is slippery. Some sources, centuries after her death, claim she had a husband named Cercilus of Andros. But even in antiquity, people joked that the name sounded suspiciously fake, Cercilus meaning Mr. Manly, and Andros being literally Man Island. It's like inventing a spouse named Chad from Judeville. Historians still argue whether this was satire rather than biography, a way of brushing aside awkward questions about her intimate life. What seems more plausible is the name Cleis, sometimes said to be her daughter. In a surviving fragment, Sappho speaks of Cleis as her beautiful child, for whom she would not trade all Lydia nor lovely Lesbos. The tenderness rings true, though whether Cleis was her literal daughter or a symbolic name remains uncertain. Still, you can imagine Sappho in a domestic moment bending low to tie a child's sandal or brushing hair fragrant with olive oil. Here's a mainstream fact: women of Sappho's aristocratic class usually married, often forming political alliances between families. Remaining unmarried would have been unusual, though not impossible. If Sappho did marry, her poetry gives little trace of a conventional wife's voice, no housekeeping manuals, no odes to the joys of spinning wool. Instead, her verses return again and again to passion, longing, and the delicate dance of relationships. Picture a wedding on Lesbos. Torches flare as night falls, the bride is veiled, and guests sing songs, maybe even Sappho's own compositions. If she stood among them as both composer and participant, the layers would have blurred, poet blessing the bride woman, reflecting on her own path. And here's a quirky tidbit: some ancient authors accused her of being too focused on her circle of women and their affections, so much so that they felt compelled to balance the story with tales of her being married off. It's as though they couldn't quite stomach the idea of a woman famous for poetry existing outside the conventional domestic frame. You can almost hear them muttering, "Well, surely she had a husband, surely." But even if marriage and motherhood were part of her life, her poetry rarely lingers there. The fragments don't describe the grind of daily chores or the politics of family alliances. Instead, they capture the tremors of parting, the sweetness of companionship, the ache of longing. Perhaps the absence is telling domestic life might have been background noise, while her real voice belonged to the moments when desire took center stage. Historians still debate whether to read Cleis as a daughter or as a metaphorical stand-in for a student friend or poetic persona. The ambiguity is maddening, but it also preserves a kind of intimacy. Whatever the case, the verses make clear that she cherished someone named Cleis deeply enough to place her above kingdoms and riches. That's as personal as fragments get. You walk further into her imagined household, the scent of baking bread, a jug of wine, half-empty sandals scattered by the doorway. In a corner sits the lyre strings loosened for the night. Domestic life may have claimed her hours, but the poems claim her soul, and they've outlasted every clay pot and every crumbling wall. So the question of husband and child hovers unresolved like a candle flame flickering in a breeze. What remains certain is that Sappho knew the textures of intimacy, whether maternal, romantic, or both, and her poetry folded those textures into verse. The home, the circle, the public square, all were stages for her voice, but it's the notes of longing and tenderness that survived the centuries. By the time you step back out into the Lesbos night, you feel the ambiguity hanging over you. Was she wife, mother, lover, teacher? Probably all of the above, and yet none define her completely. What remains is the poetry, fragmented, shimmering, and stubbornly resistant to being boxed into biography, and perhaps that's the point. The road curls downward toward the docks, where salt air mingles with tar and fish guts, and suddenly the sea seems louder than thought itself. Sappho's life, no matter how tightly you try to trace it on Lesbos, eventually points outward across the Aegean, into exile and toward the blur of politics that even poetry couldn't escape. You lean against a weather-worn post listening to gulls squabble overhead, and you try to imagine her leaving the island she sang into legend. The sources say she was exiled to Sicily, specifically to Syracuse. Why, well, that's where the guessing game begins. Some argue it was political, perhaps her family was tied to the wrong faction during one of the many local upheavals. Others say it was personal scandal, a falling out, or simply the shifting winds of aristocratic fortunes. Historians still argue whether she left willingly under compulsion or whether later writers simply imagined her in Sicily to explain the survival of her songs there. Here's a mainstream fact: by the 5th century BCE, statues of Sappho were erected in Syracuse, suggesting her reputation had settled deeply into Sicilian soil. This wasn't just a passing visitor. The city chose to honor her permanently. You can almost picture locals repeating her lines centuries after her death, the words salted by distance, but still warm with longing. Now for a quirky tidbit, one legend claims she fled to Sicily because of heartbreak, an unrequited passion that sent her wandering like a lovesick lyric in human form. It's the kind of romantic drama later biographers love to pin on her, because heaven forbid a poetess simply be caught in a messy political shuffle when she could instead be cast as the star of her own tragic romance. You step onto the imagined deck of her ship, the timbers creaking, the horizon stretching endless. The sea wind whips through her hair as the coastline of Lesbos shrinks behind her. Did she press her hand to her heart, grieving separation from her beloved circle, or did she take the moment as fuel for yet another poem of loss? The fragments are silent, but the silence itself feels poetic. Exile, whether real or exaggerated, shaped how later cultures viewed her. The idea of the wandering poetess, uprooted by fate, yet still carrying her lyre, gave her a mythic edge. In Syracuse, she may have continued teaching, composing, performing her verses, serving as bridges between memory and new beginnings. Imagine a group of Sicilian girls gathering in a courtyard, their accents strange to her ear, but their laughter familiar. She lifts her lyre again, and the songs continue. Historians still debate whether any of the surviving fragments date to her time in Sicily or if the connection is more symbolic than literal. But the fact that her name and Syracuse became entwined suggests her presence left ripples that outlived her footsteps. Think about it, exile magnifies identity. A poet from Lesbos is notable, but a poet from Lesbos remembered in Sicily becomes legend. Her words travelled not just by voice but by displacement, a reminder that cultural survival sometimes depends on scattering seeds beyond their home soil. A quirky comparison for you today? When a band leaves its hometown and tours, fans often remember the place they stopped, not where they started. Syracuse, in a sense, became one of her tour stops that refused to let go, claiming her as their own. You wander the imagined streets of ancient Syracuse, whitewashed walls glaring under the sun, market cries rising above the clang of bronze. Somewhere in a quieter court, Sappho may have sat beneath a fig tree, teaching new students the same melodies she once taught on Lesbos. The exile wasn't silence, it was continuation in another key. And yet, as night falls on this foreign shore, the melancholy hum of separation lingers. Exile turns every familiar sound into echo, every taste into memory. Still her words endure resilient like seaweed, clinging to rock no matter how strong the tide. You realize the story of Sappho isn't confined to a single island. It was destined to drift, just like her songs carried far, by winds she couldn't control. The gull cries fade, and you find yourself moving not across seas but across centuries, slipping into the candle-lit glow of a Roman villa. Marble floors echo under sandal steps, frescoes shimmer with mythic scenes, and tucked into a niche is a slim roll of papyrus labeled with a single name, Sappho. Her voice, though written on fragile material, had somehow leapt the gulf from archaic Greece into the hands of later poets. Romans loved borrowing Greece's best ideas, gods, architecture, and yes, poetry. For them, Sappho became an icon of lyric intensity, a shorthand for passion, compressed into perfect form. Horace once boasted that his own verses placed him alongside Sappho and Alcaeus like two honored spirits in a celestial concert. You picture him strutting a little as he wrote that, pleased with his own cleverness. Mainstream fact-to-vide master of witty love poetry devoted a whole fictional letter to her in his Heroides. In it, he imagines Sappho pining for a man named Phaon, pouring out longing in polished Latin couplets. Did Sappho actually fall in love with a ferryman? Historians still argue whether Ovid invented Phaon entirely or simply amplified a scrap of local legend. Either way, it shows how Romans reshaped her into their own dramatic archetype, the lovesick genius. And here's a quirky tidbit: statues of Sappho popped up in Roman contexts, sometimes showing her with a scroll or a lyre, but always wrapped in that aura of tragic brilliance. To Romans, she wasn't just a poetess, she was the embodiment of lyric passion itself, almost like a brand logo for heartbreak and artistry combined. Imagine walking through a Roman library shelves stacked with papyrus rolls. Somewhere between Homer's Iliad and Euripides' tragedies sits a roll of Sappho. You unroll it carefully, squinting at the faint Greek script, and suddenly her words leap alive. Love, longing, tenderness, all still resonant, even though the air smells of Roman incense and not Aeolian sea salt. Historians still debate how much of her corpus survived intact into the Roman period. Some argue the Romans had access to 9 books of her poetry, neatly collected and organized, while others suspect the material was already fragmentary. Either way, her name held weight enough to be carved into marble inscriptions and referenced casually, as though everyone in the cultured crowd knew exactly who she was. Think of Roman banquets, couches laden with food, wine-flowing music drifting from the corner. Someone quotes a snatch of Sappho, perhaps in Greek, perhaps translated, and the table murmurs approval. She becomes part of their cultural wallpaper, woven into the elite's sense of refinement. Here's a playful image in some Roman graffiti amateur poets scrawled their own love lines, often clumsy imitations of the greats. Imagine a love-struck Roman teenager scratching a verse on a wall, wishing it sounded as smooth as Sappho's, but ending up more like, "Roses are red, violets are blue. You ghosted me, now I'm sad too." Even so, the urge to channel her style shows how enduring her reputation was. The villa grows quiet as you step deeper into its chambers. The walls echo with centuries of admiration, misinterpretation, and reinvention. Romans didn't preserve Sappho as she was, they refashioned her to suit their own ideals of passion and artistry. But even in their adaptations, her essence remained visible intensity lyricism and that unflinching dive into human emotion. By the time the oil lamp gutters low, you realize her afterlife had only just begun. Rome carried her forward but not untouched. Each retelling, each statue, each invented romance layered myth upon history. Yet somehow, across all those centuries, the core survived verses brief, as breaths sharp as longing and impossible to ignore. The villa walls dissolve into dust, and you drift further forward in time where the chants of monks echo under vaulted stone. It is the Middle Ages now, and Sappho's voice becomes a whisper, nearly lost in the clamour of Latin hymns and illuminated manuscripts. You shuffle through a drafty scriptorium candles, sputter ink-stained fingers, scratch across parchment, and rows of bound volumes stare like mute witnesses. Somewhere once there may have been her books, but now only scraps remain. Here's a mainstream fact by late antiquity. Sappho's poems had been collected into 9 books, likely organized by meter. But in the medieval world, her works suffered neglect. Christian scribes who decided which texts were worth copying often turned toward moral treatises and scripture, not verses full of longing and sensuality. Historians still argue whether her disappearance was due to deliberate censorship or simple disinterest. The quirky tidbit, a Byzantine encyclopedia called the Suda, compiled in the 10th century, still listed Sappho's works and gave a short biography. But reading it feels like rummaging through someone else's attic, tantalizing labels without the objects they once described. Imagine opening a box labeled Sappho's 9 books, only to find it empty, save for dust and a single broken string from a lyre. Yet fragments clung on, smuggled inside quotations by others. Church fathers eager to lecture against pagan excess sometimes preserved her words inadvertently by citing them as examples of moral danger. You picture a stern bishop muttering, "Beware this scandalous poetry," and in doing so accidentally safeguarding the very lines he meant to bury. Historians still debate the extent of active suppression. Did monks destroy her texts because they considered them indecent? Or did fragile papyrus simply crumble without enough readers to keep copying them? Either way, silence settled over her voice for centuries. Step into a medieval classroom, students chant, Aristotle copy, Virgil, and puzzle over Homer. Sappho, once their equal, is absent, her place in the canon interrupted. The room feels emptier for it, as though someone removed a vital instrument from an orchestra, leaving only ghostly gaps in the harmony. And yet, she wasn't wholly gone. A Latin translation or passing reference would surface now and again, like driftwood washed ashore. Some medieval scholars even classified her among the 9 lyric poets of Greece, though they had precious little of her work to prove why. Her name became legend more than literature, like a star glimpsed faintly through cloud. Quirky thought for you: imagine a medieval monk dozing after a long day of copying sermons, dreaming that he hears Sappho's lyre in the distance. He might never have read her words, but the reputation alone could haunt the silence, reminding him of a voice too tender, too earthly, perhaps too unsettling for his cloistered walls. As the centuries drag on, you tread quietly through libraries where the shelves creak and shadows gather. Each book you touch seems to sigh with absence. The gap where Sappho should be grows louder than the words that remain. Her poetry, once sung in public squares and whispered in bedrooms, shrinks into a handful of quoted lines, each fragment like a shard of broken pottery. The Middle Ages teach you this: survival is not guaranteed, even for genius. Fame flickers, scrolls rot, the wrong librarian makes the wrong choice, and entire worlds vanish. Yet even in near silence, Sappho lingered. Her name never erased her legend, never wholly snuffed out. She became a rumor strong enough to last until rediscovery. You step back from the scriptorium feeling the weight of centuries pressing in. The candles gutter lower, the chants fade, and in the darkness you realize sometimes history survives not in abundance, but in whispers stubborn enough to refuse oblivion. The chill of the monastery fades, and you drift into brighter, sharper air, the Renaissance. Paints gleam, presses rumble, and scholars pore over manuscripts with the giddy thrill of rediscovery. Europe is waking up from its medieval slumber, and in this dawn, Sappho's faint whispers begin to stir again. You walk into a print shop, the smell of ink sharp, the clatter of movable type steady, and somewhere amid the racks of letters lies her name, waiting to be reset into history. Mainstream fact Renaissance humanists obsessed with reviving classical learning scoured monasteries and libraries for forgotten Greek texts. Though Sappho's complete books were gone, her fragments survived in quotations and scholia. Scholars translated and recopied these scraps, reintroducing her to readers who hadn't heard her voice in 1,000 years. Historians still argue whether the Renaissance scholars understood her context, or whether they read her through their own filters of morality and decorum. Quirky tidbit: in the 16th century French poet Pierre de Ronsard declared himself Sappho's heir in lyric passion. He wasn't alone. Many Renaissance poets treated her as a muse, an almost mythical embodiment of pure lyric fire. Imagine strutting around a court in elaborate ruffs declaring, "I'm basically the new Sappho," while half your audience politely nods and the other half stifles a laugh. You step into an Italian salon, frescoes overhead, wine goblets clinking, verses traded like precious jewels. A scholar recites a translated fragment like the sweet apple reddening high on the branch. The listeners sigh, some with genuine feeling, others with the performative gusto of Renaissance intellectuals showing off. You can almost hear them thinking, "Ah yes, I too am sensitive and refined." Historians still debate how much of her personal voice came through in these translations. Latin versions often softened or obscured themes of female desire, adjusting them to suit the sensibilities of a Christian audience. The result, a Sappho, both celebrated and censored, half rediscovered and half reimagined. Printing presses amplified her reach. What once had been the whispered survival of scraps now multiplied into hundreds of copies. Her fragments entered anthologies, commentaries, and scholarly debates. She was no longer only a rumor, she was ink on paper again. A quirky scene to picture in Elizabethan England: a scholar excitedly unrolls a freshly printed anthology of Greek lyric poetry. He traces the letters with ink-stained fingers, muttering translations until his friend leans over and asks, "Who's this Sappho?" The scholar straightens dramatically, "Only the greatest poetess of antiquity." His friend blinks and replies, "Never heard of her." And thus the long process of re-education begins. The Renaissance treated Sappho as both inspiration and curiosity. She became part of a pantheon of rediscovered geniuses, invoked in sonnets, painted in allegorical scenes, sometimes shown as a tragic lover gazing out to sea. You stroll through a gallery where her likeness appears in oils, idealized, draped, timeless, staring dreamily as though caught between memory and myth. And yet beneath the varnish and verse the fragments still glimmer. Even a handful of lines, her apple, her garland, her invocation of Aphrodite, were enough to electrify minds hungry for beauty. You realize the Renaissance didn't restore her fully, but it pulled her back into daylight, ensuring her name would not slip away again. As you leave the bustling print shop behind, the air hums with possibility. For the first time in centuries, Sappho has an audience again, not as loud as Homer's, not as complete as once before, but real, tangible, growing. Her survival has become a relay, each age handing forward what it could salvage. And in the Renaissance, the torch glows brighter, casting her shadow into the modern world. You step out of frescoed salons and into the sharper corridors of the 18th and 19th centuries, where powdered wigs give way to industrial smoke and literary salons buzz with speculation. Sappho is no longer just a rediscovered curiosity, she's a lightning rod. Every generation seems determined to claim her, define her, or reshape her to fit its own ideals. You wander into a drawing room lined with velvet drapes, where critics argue over tea, each convinced they alone hold the real Sappho. Mainstream fact: in this period, scholars translated more fragments and debated endlessly about her life, especially her loves. Did she desire women as her poetry suggests? Did she yearn for men as Ovid's Phaon tale insists? Or was she simply a symbol of passion, detached from biography? Historians still argue whether these interpretations reveal more about Sappho or about the prejudices of the people reading her. Here's a quirky tidbit: in Victorian England, publishers sometimes Baudelarized her poems, smoothing over any hint of same-sex affection. A line about one girl gazing at another might be rephrased into something neutral, as if the translator were an embarrassed uncle editing a diary before the family could read it. Yet in private circles, readers whispered about the real Sappho, sensing truths between the lines. In France, she was painted as a tragic heroine, doomed by unrequited love. Romantic artists adored the image of her leaping from the cliffs of Lucas, a legend probably invented much later, but irresistible to dramatists. You can almost hear the violin swelling as she stands on the precipice, shawl whipping in the wind, lyre clutched to her chest, gazing into the abyss. Never mind that the story lacks evidence it made for a great opera. Across the Atlantic, early feminist writers began invoking her as proof of women's intellectual and artistic capacity. See, they argued, women have always written, always sung, always mattered. Sappho became both muse and weapon, her survival a rebuttal to centuries of exclusion. Historians still debate the Phaon legend with almost comical persistence. Was it a Roman invention, a medieval moral tale, or simply a literary device that stuck? The obsession shows how uncomfortable later centuries were with taking Sappho at her word. Her affection for women didn't fit their categories, so they reached for a convenient ferryman to explain it away. Quirky image: picture a stiff Victorian parlour where guests politely sip tea while a host nervously reads aloud a translation of Sappho. Half the room nods at the beauty of the verse, while the other half fidgets, cheeks pinking, because they suspect that the lines mean more than the translator admits. You almost want to tap one of them on the shoulder and whisper, "Yes, you're right." She really was that bold. By the 19th century, Sappho had become a paradox, exalted as the 10th muse, yet constantly sanitized, misrepresented, or sensationalized. She was a saint of passion, a tragic lover, a proto-feminist, a scandalous curiosity, all at once. Each interpretation added layers, but also distance, burying the woman herself under myth upon myth. And yet, beneath all the noise, her fragments continued to glow. A line here, a phrase there, still enough to cut through centuries of distortion. Even translated, even censored, they carried that unmistakable intimacy, that sense you were overhearing a confession too delicate for public ears. You leave the parlour, stepping into foggy gaslit streets, carriages rattling by, newspapers flapping in the wind. The debates follow you, voices rising and falling, never quite agreeing. And you realize part of Sappho's strange immortality lies in this very uncertainty. Each age argues over her, reshaping her reflection, but none can erase her. Her fragments survive every retelling, whispering across centuries with maddening persistence. The gas lamps flicker out, and you find yourself in the bustle of the 20th century crowds rushing through stations, newspapers shouting headlines, and tucked amid the noise, a rediscovery that sends ripples through the scholarly world. Archaeologists brush away sand from crumbling papyri in Egypt, and suddenly Sappho speaks again with a voice not heard for nearly 2 millennia. Mainstream fact: beginning in the late 19th and accelerating through the 20th century, excavations at Oxyrhynchus and elsewhere unearthed papyrus fragments containing her verses. These weren't just second-hand quotes, they were her words inked long ago, now resurfacing under desert sun. Historians still argue whether the fragments we've recovered represent a fraction of her original 9 books or scattered remnants beyond counting. Here's a quirky tidbit: some papyri were found reused as mummy wrappings. Imagine being immortalized, not because monks copied your work, but because someone thought your old scroll made decent embalming material. Fast forward 2,000 years, and suddenly scholars are delicately unpeeling layers of linen, squinting at faded Greek letters, realizing they've just stumbled onto Sappho's voice. You follow her words into a modern classroom. A professor paces, chalk in hand, scrawling stanzas across a board. Students lean forward, startled by how direct she sounds. He seems to me equal to the gods. The room falls silent, and you realize her intimacy still startles even after centuries of industrial revolutions and radio static. Historians still debate how best to interpret these rediscovered lines. Should they be read as personal confessions, as performances, as ritual lyrics? Each new papyrus adds fuel to the argument. One discovery might confirm an old guess, another might unravel it entirely. Picture the excitement newspapers in the 1920s announcing new poem of Sappho found, academics scrambling, translators rushing into print readers, marveling that she still had new things to say after being thought nearly lost. It's like finding an unopened message in a bottle only to realize it was tossed into the sea 2,000 years ago. Quirky scene for you: in 2014, scholars announced yet another papyrus discovery, what they called the Brothers poem. It mentions her siblings by name, giving biographical hints that scholars had begged for centuries to confirm. But the news coverage, it focused almost as much on how the papyrus had been privately owned and mysteriously surfaced like a rare baseball card traded in secret. Even in rediscovery, her verses arrive with drama. The 20th century also saw her embraced by new movements. Feminist scholars championed her as a lost voice of female creativity, finally recovering space in a canon long dominated by men. LGBTQ communities embraced her as an ancestral figure, someone whose unapologetic affection for women offered a lineage of legitimacy. Her fragments became more than literature. They became banners, whispered proof that history had always been more complex than official versions admitted. And through it all, her poems themselves continued to work their spell. Short, incomplete, sometimes broken midline, yet they carried that same haunting immediacy. You imagine a fragment glowing on the page like an ember, fragile, flickering, but capable of sparking whole forests of imagination. You step into a modern library, fluorescent lights, hum card, catalogues shuffle, and in a climate-controlled room, papyrus fragments rest behind glass. Visitors lean close, breathing fog on the glass, marveling at the faint lines of Greek. Across time and decay, the poetess of Lesbos whispers, still her words more alive now than they've been in centuries. By the end of the 20th century, Sappho is no longer just rumor or legend. She's once again a writer you can read, if only in pieces, if only through careful reconstruction, yet those pieces feel precious like relics. Each discovery pulls her a little closer, reminding you that survival isn't neat, but it can still be miraculous. The hum of fluorescent lights dims, and now you step into the noisy, glowing blur of the 21st century. Screens flicker everywhere, phones, tablets, laptops, and somehow amid cat videos and endless news scrolls, Sappho has found her way into the digital age. You lean over a glowing monitor, and there she is, her fragments scrolling in translation on a blog, her words tweeted in bite-sized lines, her voice, once again, a presence in everyday life. Mainstream fact new translations of Sappho have multiplied in recent decades, each offering fresh takes on her surviving fragments. Some lean toward poetic freedom, others cling tightly to the Greek. Historians still argue whether to preserve the jagged gaps of papyrus or to smooth them with imaginative reconstructions. Each choice reveals how modern readers wrestle with ancient silence. Quirky tidbit: one of Sappho's poems, sometimes called Fragment 31, he seems to me equal to the gods, has become a social media favorite, shared endlessly with hashtags, memes, even tattooed on wrists. A verse once whispered at a feast on Lesbos is now copy-pasted across Instagram captions. You almost expect to see it set to lo-fi beats on a sleep playlist. You scroll further, Feminist writers celebrate her as proof of women's literary heritage. Queer communities honor her as an icon, reclaiming her unapologetic voice of desire. Scholars trade PDFs, debating whether her meters should be clapped, tapped, or counted. Her words, once hidden in fragile papyrus, now glow in pixels on millions of devices. Historians still debate whether our fascination with her is more about her poetry or about the gaps, the mysteries we can't solve. The missing lines leave room for projection, and in that space, each generation builds the Sappho they need: muse, lover, teacher, rebel. You imagine a modern classroom this time, with projectors humming, students scrolling on phones, while a professor reads aloud, "Someone I tell you will remember us." The line lands like prophecy. The students glance up, briefly startled, as if she's speaking directly to them through the glass of their screens. Quirky scene, there's even Sappho merch now: tote bags, t-shirts, mugs with her fragments. You picture her face on a coffee cup, captioned with a lyric about longing, and you can't help but smirk. Would she roll her eyes, or would she chuckle at the idea of her love poems paying for someone's oat latte? The digital age has also democratized her audience. No longer confined to scholars with access to rare manuscripts, her poems circulate freely, translated into dozens of languages, read aloud on YouTube, whispered in podcasts, turned into performance art. The circle of listeners has grown from a few girls on Lesbos to a worldwide crowd, earbuds in, nodding along. And through it all, her fragments still hum with the same intimacy. Even broken, even reimagined, they invite you closer. Sit down, listen, feel. That pull hasn't faded. If anything, the screen amplifies it, projecting her words into millions of private rooms. You close the laptop, but the glow lingers in your vision. Sappho has become both ancient and modern, both fragment and meme, both whisper and broadcast. Her survival is no longer just a matter of papyrus or parchment. It's now coded into servers, backed up in clouds, cached on hard drives. She has slipped into immortality by way of fiber optic cable. The hum of the 21st century wraps around you, full of static and light, and you realize her lyric promise, "Someone will remember us," has found its answer. Not only remembered, but tweeted, streamed, printed, shared. The voice of Lesbos, once nearly lost, now rests in your pocket, ready to sing whenever you scroll. The screen's glow fades, and you step back into a softer place, somewhere between memory and dream. You've walked with Sappho from the bustle of her island home, through centuries of silence and rediscovery, and now you linger with her in the quiet of today. She is no longer only a name in a textbook or a fragment of papyrus. She is a voice that threads through your own night, gentle, insistent, full of longing and humanity. Mainstream fact scholars now generally agree that Sappho composed 9 books of lyric poetry once preserved in the Library of Alexandria. Only a handful of complete poems and scattered fragments remain. Historians still argue whether the deliberate neglect of her work in antiquity was motivated by moral unease, gender bias, or simply the fragility of papyrus. Quirky tidbit. Sappho's birthplace, the island of Lesbos, continues to draw pilgrims, not only tourists seeking sunsets over the Aegean, but also modern admirers who bring flowers to the cliffs of Erissos, leaving them as offerings as though she might still be watching. Imagine her ghost amused tallying who brought peonies and who forgot a ribbon. Her afterlife is layered icon of lyric genius, patron saint of intimacy, a name folded into language itself, sapphic, to describe love between women. She has become adjective, archetype, cultural shorthand, and still somehow a poet whose words catch in the throat like a song half remembered. Historians still debate how close we can get to her true voice. Are we hearing Sappho the private woman, or Sappho the performer? Did she whisper these poems at dusk or sing them to crowds at festivals? The gaps remain, but maybe the gaps are part of her power. The missing pieces allow us to lean in, to dream, to keep listening. You sit now at the edge of her story, and the sea she once watched is still there, eternal and restless. Waves lap at the stone shores of Lesbos, just as they did in her lifetime. Somewhere in that rhythm, you imagine her verses carried like foam, rising and falling, breaking and reforming, never quite gone. She promised that someone would remember her. And as you lie here, eyes heavy, breath slowing, you realize she was right. The lights dim further, and your world softens into the final wind down. You picture yourself reclining by a shoreline, the Aegean stretching out endlessly, its waters shimmering with the last traces of twilight. The air is warm, touched with salt, and the waves keep up their gentle rhythm, steady as your own breathing. The rush of history, with all its noise and arguments, begins to fade. What lingers is only the softness, the way Sappho's words folded into love and longing, and how that love survived storms, flames, and centuries of forgetting. Every breath you take feels slower, deeper, like the tide drawing out to sea. The harsh edges of the world blur, replaced by a glowing hush. You remember the lyre she held, its strings humming, and you almost think you hear it now, faint like wind in a hollow reed. The sound soothes, not insistent but steady, carrying you toward calm. Your thoughts, once full of fragments and facts, now stretch out like an endless horizon. Each wave that comes to shore dissolves a little more of your tension, carrying it far away, leaving only stillness behind. Sappho's promise echoes once more, someone will remember, and you here drifting into sleep are proof. Her voice rests in your memory, now tucked safely, like a lullaby. Let the sea keep its rhythm for you tonight. Let the stars wheel overhead, slow and patient. And let your body sink into the quiet, certain that voices from the past can still cradle you in the present. Rest easy, carried on a tide that began thousands of years ago and will go on long after dreams have gathered you fully.